The battle the morning before was brutal, bloody, and over too quickly to sate the Vikings' lust for battle. A rogue spear had pierced the king's side, leaving him wounded and forcing his warband to retreat. An outside mercenary whom had befriended and swore his life to the king failed to stop the blow, and he knew his pledge was forfeit. Choosing to die by the king's blade, he stood before the assembled court and embraced the king one final time, falling to his knees as the blade sunk in, and astonished onlookers could not believe what they had beheld. What if I told you that wasn't a mere story, but something I personally experienced? Not only that, but I was the king. History and hysteria, religion and the far reaches of the occult. These and more are the children of a common thing, belief, an intrinsic part of what makes us human. I'm your host, Liam Blackwood, an independent scholar of esoterica and eccentricity, a rational skeptic, father of two, writer, and lover of life. Pull up a chair, fellow lamplighters, and let us cast the shadows back a bit as we examine what lies beneath the light of Occam's lantern. So yeah, that scene really happened. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's video of it on YouTube somewhere. I am part of a Viking reenactment troupe. I joined as a thrall, the lowest of members, and rose to one day earn the title of king by supporting the group, showing up to events, doing grunt work, politicking, befriending, and gaining power and prestige on and off the field of battle. For real. Sure, it was the 21st century, and the Viking court was a highly decorated and highly immersively set all-season rentable clubhouse with a modern kitchen and a large carpeted dining hall, but those moments were real in the moment. Sure, we cracked open cans of Pepsi and bottles of Eldred Rasputin Stout in the after-party, but during the feast we supped on mead and wine and roasted venison and period-correct bread. When people hear the phrase total immersion environment, the mind almost always jumps to virtual reality. A headset, motion controls, maybe even some science fiction vision of plugging ourselves into a machine and forgetting that the outside world exists. That's certainly one form of immersion, but it's also one of the newest. The truth is, we've been surrounding ourselves with immersive environments for as long as we've been recognizably human. We just haven't always called them that. Think about the last time you sat down with a real good book. After a while, the words on the page stop feeling like words. Your surroundings begin to fade into the background, and before long you're somewhere else entirely, be it standing next to Captain Ahab or wandering the streets of King's Landing. Nothing around you has physically changed, yet your attention has become so completely invested elsewhere that your immediate surroundings scarcely register. The same thing happens with music. A particular album can transform the atmosphere of a room without moving a single piece of furniture. A film score can make an empty highway feel adventurous, melancholy, or ominous, depending entirely on what reaches your ears. We've instinctively understood this. Always. It's why people have playlists for working out, driving, relaxing. We're not just choosing songs, we're choosing an environment for our own minds. Architecture is good at this as well. When you walk into a Gothic cathedral, regardless of your personal beliefs, you'll feel something. We've mentioned that before. Towering ceilings, filtered light through stained glass, none of this exists by accident. Those spaces were designed to make you feel small before the divine, long before a sermon was ever delivered. In the exact same way, a sports stadium fills itself with colors, chants, songs, and rituals until tens of thousands of strangers begin acting as though they've belonged to the same tribe their entire lives. Children rarely need any of this explained. Hand a child a blanket and a few chairs and they'll build a castle. Give them a stick and they'll find themselves holding a sword or a magic wand, maybe even the controls of a spaceship. Somewhere along the way, we started calling that pretend, as though it was something we're expected to outgrow. I'm not fully convinced that we ever did, admit it or not. Adults simply become more elaborate about it. Instead of building blanket forts, we decorate home libraries. Instead of pretending to be pirates, we spend a weekend at a Renaissance festival engorging in cheap beer and turkey legs. We visit themed restaurants where every employee stays in character, or travel halfway across the country to spend a few nights in cabins built to resemble the 1880s, or apartments furnished entirely like the 1950s. I've seen those Airbnbs. They're very neat, very impressive. Some people reconstruct Viking villages. The old Western town scenario is often visited as well. Others might disappear into tabletop role-playing games every Friday night. For me, it's Thursday. Or more recently, we've begun slipping on actual virtual reality headsets that let us stand on distant planets or walk through cities that never even existed. These are all expressions of the same instinct. We have an extraordinary ability to shape our surroundings in ways that encourage the mind to inhabit a different world for a little while. Sometimes that's done with books, architecture, costumes, music, or lighting. The tools change, but the impulse remains remarkably consistent. And I think that's where the word escapism begins to do these experiences a disservice. People often say the word as though escaping reality is automatically unhealthy, but that seems to be a strange criticism when you consider how often we do it without a second thought. Taking vacations, going camping, sitting around the bonfire, as per the podcast. We visit museums and amusement parks without a single bat of an eye. No one excuses those experiences of being pathological simply because they allow us to step outside of the routines of everyday life for a few hours. I think the point isn't to abandon reality at all, but to return a little better than we left it. I'll posit that point later, and maybe you'll agree. Now, when people hear the word LARP, live-action role-playing, they usually picture foam swords, elves in the woods, or perhaps a wizard arguing over spell cards. And there's certainly plenty of that, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it's also an incredibly narrow picture of what roleplay really is. At its heart, LARPing is simply the conscious decision to step into another world for a little while and behave as though its rules are your own. Once you look at it that way, the boundaries are much harder to draw. Civil War reenactors spend weekends recreating battles that happened over a century and a half ago. There's Napoleonic enthusiasts marching in uniforms stitched painfully from historical research. As I said before, my own Viking group, doing feasts, courts, even wandering through markets, and it all has a level of authenticity that, for a few hours, modern life feels just strangely distant, like a dream. Now, none of these people are confused about what century they're living in. That's never been the point. They are choosing to inhabit another place and another time because doing so offers an experience that ordinary life simply cannot. Now, by that definition, one can also look at that encapsulating airsoft and paintball communities, transforming abandoned buildings and stretches of woodland into military operations. Players adopt call signs, assign objectives, develop strategies, etc., etc. Decisions matter, teamwork matters. It's like you're standing on an actual battlefield for a bit. but with the, success and failure not necessarily carrying the emotional weight knowing that everybody's going to drive home for dinner. And I could go on to explain the same scenarios for murder mystery dinners, themed cruises, escape rooms, hell, even weddings where every guest arrives in Victorian attire. Renaissance festivals occupy an interesting place somewhere in the middle, blending education, theater, commerce, and improvisation, and just general escapism, even for the layman who has no experience with these things at all, to kind of muck it up with the nerds. But, even the most hardened person, before long being there, begins starting conversations with good morrow. It's easy to dismiss these experiences as, adults playing pretend. I'd argue that they're doing something far more interesting than that. For just a few moments, they are suspending the constant awareness of everyday life. Bills can wait. Deadlines, politics, social media, emails, tomorrow's morning alarm. It can all recede into the distance. Attention becomes focused on a single shared fiction. And because everyone around you has agreed to participate, that fiction gains a surprisingly large amount of psychological weight. There's something profoundly human about that. Long before we had theaters, cinemas, or computers, our ancestors gathered around fires to tell stories. This, again, is the principle of this podcast. They wore ceremonial clothing, danced, sang, reenacted hunts, victories, myths, and legends of their own. There was value, even then, in stepping outside of yourselves. So, in a way, we've never really stopped. We've just become more creative in the ways we do it. And as convincing as these physical experiences can be, they're still bound by the limitations of the real world. A castle, if you want it, has to be built, even if it's plywood. A battlefield has to be rented, unless your friend Bob has a large backyard. Costumes have to be sewn. Illusion only extends as far as the eye can see. However, as technology begins to improve, we start to see those limits being removed one by one. The moment computers became capable of connecting people together, it was almost inevitable that we'd begin building new worlds inside of them. The earliest examples were remarkably humble by today's standards. Text adventures, multi-user dungeons, better known as MUDs, and bulletin board systems, where a handful of people could collectively imagine themselves inhabiting the same fictional space. I myself ran a few Vampire the Masquerade role-playing boards back in the day, and we'll probably get back around to that in the decompression chamber. Suffice to say on the matter, there were no elaborate graphics. Sometimes there weren't any graphics at all, just words on a screen and enough imagination to bridge the gap. And somehow it worked. It turns out our brains don't demand photorealism nearly as much as they demand participation. Now, as technology marched forward, those little text worlds slowly gave way to graphical ones. Ultima Online, EverQuest, Dark Age of Camelot, World of Warcraft, each generation making the worlds feel a little larger, a little more convincing, and a little bit more alive than the last. Now, for me, the big gateway was, of course, Ultima Online. When it came out, when it launched, I still remember logging in those early days and realizing that there were actual people behind every character walking around Britannia. Shopkeepers weren't always scripted NPCs. The person mining ore next to you had their own plans for the evening. Guilds formed naturally. Rivalries developed. Some people became manic murder hobos waiting for you to leave the range of guards. Economies emerged without anyone forcing them into existence, something we'll touch on again later. A lot of games like EVE Online have entire like jobs and employment inside the game that people will pay real money for you to do. That's so incredible to think about when it comes to the range of this being immersive for people. But there's a time in each of these when it stops feeling like a game remarkably quickly and becomes a place, a sanctuary, somewhere to go. Looking back, that's probably the first time I experienced a persistent digital world. Not one that paused when I looked away or shut the computer off or logged off for the night, but one that kept existing whether I was there or not. Somewhere while I slept or at school, people were still crafting, building, fighting, and I had to worry about my house getting broken into because back in the day, player versus player was so unhinged. There's a strangely profound realization to be had when you find something that young. Nowadays, it's everywhere, but back then it was a new frontier. And I began to understand that a world doesn't have to be physical to feel meaningful. You know, fast forward a couple of decades and we've taken that idea enormous steps further, where it's pretty much what we live in is the digital landscape. Virtual reality no longer asks you to look through a monitor into another world, it asks you to step into it though, and that's kind of the next phase as far as I'm concerned. Even today's consumer headsets are enough to trick your senses into surprising instincts. You duck when something flies towards your face, lean on tables that aren't there. Plenty of first-time users discover their legs become slightly uncertain when standing on the edge of a simulated cliff. Knowledge and instinct are not the same thing. And you start adding to that illusion in different ways to become more and more immersed. There's the racing enthusiasts building a cockpit that vibrates with the engine, complete with force feedback steering. Flight simulator hobbyists. I'll get to that later in the decompression chamber. There's a good video out there I'd highly recommend on the subject, but to return to the episode itself, every year the line moves a little further. Every year the illusion asks a little less work of our imagination because technology is doing more of it. What's fascinating though isn't the hardware, it's what the hardware reveals about us. Because we have been striving for this for thousands of years, building places capable of transporting the mind somewhere else. We started with stories around campfires, graduated to theaters, reenactments, novels, films, sprawling online worlds. Virtual reality isn't a departure from that journey. It's just the newest milestone, which raises the uncomfortable question: if we've spent thousands of years making these more convincing, what happens when we succeed? What is at the end of the rainbow, so to say? Now, if we stop and really look at the direction that things have been moving, it's difficult not to see the pattern we've already established in this episode. Every generation is intent on making the barrier just a little thinner. And I don't think we're anywhere close to being finished with the current example of virtual reality. Take artificial companionship, for example. Now, I know exactly what most people think when they hear that phrase. Real dolls, and their implication of mimicked human companionship. Hollywood certainly hasn't helped matters, and the internet, well, the internet will always be the internet. There's an assumption that if someone is building an artificial companion, it must be for romantic or sexual purposes. And that's certainly one avenue. Humanity has never been shy about monetizing intimacy. And while that is an image and sentiment that most will find quite alluring, it's far from the entire picture. Loneliness isn't exclusively romantic. Sometimes you simply want someone to talk to, someone to bounce ideas off of while you're driving to work, someone that remembers what you've been interested in lately, or notices you've been unusually quiet for a few days. Someone that shares your excitement when you finally finish writing that novel, painting that miniature, beating the game you're stuck on. We're social creatures. Always have been. Companionship has value completely independent of romance. What's fascinating is we're beginning to build machines that can provide at least the illusion of that companionship. Whether they're truly intelligent isn't even the interesting question anymore. The interesting question is how our minds respond to them. I mean, people already name their cars. They apologize to Roombas after bumping into them, or put googly eyes on them like my wife. Children become attached to stuffed animals. Adults talk to their pets like they're old friends. Our brains are remarkably willing to form relationships with almost anything that behaves consistently enough. And it's not just empathy, but other mental exercises and indulgences as well, simply beyond the flesh. Power. To have control over something or someone else. The more sapient, the better. It's something the fetish community caters to well enough, but artificial companions would expand it from the human element, bringing rules of attraction, compatibility, and more completely out of the equation, making it available for anyone who so desires. We'll touch on that control issue a little later, but no matter what the emotional expression or outlet needed, artificial intelligence on said matter simply raises that tendency to an entirely different level of personal independence. And that's before you even give it a face. Science fiction's been exploring that possibility for decades. Westworld probably springs to mind for a lot of people, and don't worry, I've got plenty to say about that and movies like The Matrix later in the decom chamber. But I think popular fiction has actually distracted us from what's likely to happen first. The future probably isn't perfectly human androids sitting across from you at breakfast. It's your house, your environment. Walking through your front door after one of those days where absolutely everything went wrong, and before you've even said a word, the lights soften. The thermostat nudges itself a couple degrees warmer. Music you've always associated with comfort begins quietly playing in the background, and, well, dinner's already been started because your home recognized your schedule, and you'd be getting in late. Not because it loves you, or because it's alive, but simply because it's adapted to know you. That, to me, feels far more likely than humanoid robots replacing the neighbors for anything other than themed attractions. Then there's the question of how we interact with these environments. Today's virtual reality is impressive, but it's still very obviously hardware. We strap screens to our faces, we grip controls, companies are experimenting with tactile gloves to help feel resistance. Haptic suits get better every day. And again, those racing and flight simulators that shake with every bump in the road. And they're incredible pieces of engineering, but they're also stepping stones. The real destination almost certainly lies somewhere deeper. Direct neural interfacing has been inching forward for years now. The idea of bypassing our hands, our eyes, and eventually even our ears, and communicating directly with the brain, has gone from science fiction to legitimate research. Today, much of that work is focused on genuinely noble goals, allowing paralyzed patients to control computers, restoring movement, restoring communication, perhaps even senses that were lost. But once the technology exists, humanity has a habit of finding uses for it that its inventors maybe never quite put so forward. If one day we can transmit experiences directly to our brain, the very concept of immersion changes forever. At that point, you're not looking at another world, you're experiencing it. quite like The Matrix, or if one's played Cyberpunk 2077, the brain dances. If you're more of a Shadowrun person, then BTLs or Better Than Life chips. And I think that's maybe where this whole conversation starts to shift, becoming less about technology and more about psychology. Because every invention we've talked about today, from Renaissance fairs to MMORPGs, has been about solving the same problem in a different way. They're all trying to answer a question humanity has apparently been asking for thousands upon thousands of years. Why do we feel such a profound need to leave ordinary life behind? Even temporarily, of course. The answer is escapism. But I don't think, again, that that's the right word for this. It runs much deeper than that. So, at this point, we've wandered through Viking halls, fairs, MMOs, virtual reality, flight simulators, artificial companions, and plugging in our brain entirely. And it's attempts to satisfy the same handful of human needs. And one of the biggest needs for most people who don't have it in real life is control. Not control directly over other people. I mean, that's something else entirely. But it could very well be part of this as well, because it's control over the environment immediately surrounding us. Most of our life isn't really ours. We wake up when the alarm tells us to. We drive roads someone else built to jobs that existed long before we are ever there. We are spending our days inside systems designed by people we'll never meet, and even when we enjoy our work, it's always there that we're just participating in someone else's world. Immersion flips that around. Now, whether it's been a campsite or decorating a house in an online game, getting that racing rig together, or just setting up the chat room or your desktop on your computer the way you want it. Or, hell, buying that new pair of headphones. The rules are yours. The atmosphere is yours. You decide what belongs there and what doesn't. That doesn't make you a actual monarch or figure authority. It gives you ownership over a tiny corner of existence. And I think people desperately underestimate how psychologically healthy that can be. And that reason could also be why you need a companion. And maybe one day those virtual companions that we have will look and sound almost indistinguishably from us in our actual environment. Maybe they won't. Either way, I think with these and the environments, what people are really chasing isn't a replacement for humanity or for existence, but rather some way to fill the needs our increasingly busy lives often leave unattended. And again, that carries over to emotional health. Modern society asks us to keep ourselves remarkably well contained. Anger should stay hidden, fear should stay hidden, grief gets a few allotted days before we're expected to move on, and even excitement has its socially acceptable volume. Those emotions don't simply disappear because we've become better at suppressing them, they accumulate. Immersion gives them somewhere to go. Whether that's a horror film that lets you safely flirt with fear, or a competitive game that allows aggression without consequence, or spending an afternoon wandering through your farmlands and having your wonder replace that anxiety for a little while. Whatever form it takes, you're exercising parts of yourself that everyday life doesn't always have room for. And there's an interesting split in how people seek that balance. Sometimes the goal is complete solitude. You close the door, put on a headset, open a book, disappear into a workshop, lose yourself in a game for an evening. Nobody expects anything from you. Nobody needs anything from you. The world can wait outside for a few hours while you simply exist. But other times, it's the complete opposite. Tabletop role-playing only comes alive because everyone at the table is committed to the same shared illusion. Living history groups, airsoft events, themed cruises, conventions. Cosplaying is a wonderful example of immersion. It's not always about escape. Sometimes it's about belonging or reclaiming a sense of authorship over your own life. Often it can be simply about finding a place where the outside world quiets down enough to let you hear yourself think. When people dismiss these experiences as escapism, I think they're accidentally treating the word as though it's inherently negative. I mean, of course, we're trying to escape something. We're escaping stress, monotony, constant barrages of obligations that define adulthood. The mistake is assuming that that's unhealthy by default. Like I said, nobody criticizes someone for taking a vacation or accuses someone of avoiding reality because they've spent the afternoon fishing. Immersion is simply another way of stepping outside the machinery of everyday life long enough to return with your bearings restored. And perhaps that's why every civilization we've ever studied has invented their own versions of these experiences. Whether it was ritual, theater, festivals, tournaments, reenactments, novels, online worlds, or whatever comes next. Humanity keeps rebuilding these little islands that exist just outside of ordinary reality. Not because we can't bear reality, but because occasionally stepping away from it makes us better equipped to return. Of course, there's much more to this that we'll for sure be addressing in a later episode. I imagine artificial companions will be an eventual deep dive due to my thoughts on the subject, as will the power of nostalgia. That is a big one here when it comes to immersion. But on that note, I really think that we need to take a step back, embrace the theme of the episode, draw our deep breath, kick our feet out, and slide right on down to that decompression chamber. All right, man, where to start on that? First off, I want to say that moving forward, we're going to do the decompression chamber a little bit differently. The first thing I want to do moving directly into it is just kind of express my blunt thoughts on the matter. And for this one, oh man, bring it on. I would love direct neural interface environments. I see the potential for them being abused, but I mean, oof, chef's kiss all around. I feel like everything in this episode was kind of decompression adjacent. I toyed with the whole episode just being one big decompression chamber, but I just couldn't quite get it to jive well. So, going into the general flow, what are my virtual retreats? I know I mentioned Ultima Online earlier, but funnily enough, I haven't actually played that since the original servers back in the day. Instead, what I use it for is actually building worlds, using things like ServUO and RunUO, which are kind of make your own client programs to run my own worlds, or shards as they call them. It's kind of become my god game, strangely enough. Let's see, Starfield. I know a lot of people didn't like that one, and they'll say EVE Online or Elite Dangerous is much better, and I get it, I really do. But I literally have a spaceflight playlist on Spotify for this game, and full immersion mods up the wazoo, monitoring fuel and repairs, ignoring the mainline quests, and have modded it to high heaven to feel like I'm really living the NASA punk post-humanism dream. On the topic of transhumanism, Cyberpunk 2077 has been a big one post-patch. I know Night City like the back of my corpo hand. Red Dead 2, if I'm feeling like a good Western kick. You know, as much as I love Mafia films, there just haven't been that many good immersive games for that. I would love that. Conan Exiles is a good survival building one that's got a good fantasy power outlet for it. Sadly, my reenactment group kind of got sidelined by, well, the double whammy of me handing over the crown so I could focus on my growing kids and job and all that, hit with a sledgehammer that was COVID-19, and that made it kind of sputter out. Several members kind of do their own thing in other groups and events, but there really hasn't been a big Empire shindig in a while. I'm really feeling the itch to get back out there now that I'm in better shape too. Jesus, that was a tangent. Back on task, let's see. Haven't really been to any real big theme park areas or event spaces that utilize this much. Thinking things like Universal's different theme park environments, Galaxy's Edge when it was in its prime, Meow Wolf installations. My brother went to one of those. Things like that. Immersion through architecture is just an amazing set of design principles. As far as fiction, I love that it's almost always negative portrayals of human companions, like Megan or Ex Machina, where stuff always goes wrong, because you know well and good if there were any positive portrayals of that kind of thing, people would think it's too creepy. There's that uncanny valley effect coming into play that we've addressed before. Blade Runner. Blade Runner is an all-time classic in terms of the replicants and showing what happens when sentience starts to form. I think that and Westworld are prime examples of it not just being dangers of AI gaining sentience, but more about the question itself of what is sentience. Where do we draw the line? Maybe it's the old Frankenstein fear of what we create being our own doom, or, at least the concept of everything we make being as flawed as us. Snap back to reality as it stands. Oop, there goes gravity. Another cool example that I don't think we really brushed on, other than a few mentions here and there in the beginning, was these simulator rigs, like flight simulator cockpits, racing rigs with hydraulic motions, truck simulator setups. My brother tried out one of those VR kind of treadmill things where you walk in place, said, that was quite the workout. Papa Meat did a really good video on this. You might know him as Meat Canyon. Definitely recommend looking that up on YouTube. The video title is Spending $10,000 on a Fake Job. But, at some point you spent several thousands pretending to drive a Peterbilt, and as an Epicurean myself, I can highly respect the commitment. People think immersion is some exotic thing, but it really isn't. I touched on it in the episode, noise-canceling headphones, reading in a coffee shop, candlelight during dinner, putting on rain sounds when you go to sleep, little nature sound CDs, just decorating your office. You're constantly curating your own reality. And I think the opposite of escapism is not responsibility. I think it's stagnation. Every civilization we've built has had temples, theaters, festivals, costumes. We've needed places where the ordinary world gives way to something larger. And I don't believe that that's running away from reality, but rather taking a break from the harsh and alien environment it can be at times, and coming back with a fresh sense of being and a greater will to improve the here and now. And with that, I'd like to thank each and every one of my listeners yet again for being a part of this transformative time in my own personal environment. You've seen my posts on this matter in social media, and a bit of a look inside of my own environments. I hope you enjoyed that, and once again appreciate any and all questions, comments, and correspondence. On any of my social media channels, you can reach me, as well as at LiamLykos at zohomail.com. That's LiamLykos at zohomail.com. It's really cliche to say this, but a like, share, download, comment, or subscribe really does help the show develop and find its audience. We're at a 2-month period now, and I really want to keep the flow going and getting it out there. I appreciate each of you for helping me do that. So, join us next Friday for episode 12, where we will finally address the Satan in the room, as I take on the role of devil's advocate and lay down the truths and expose the fallacies on our deep dive into Satanism. Until then, keep the fire stoked and the lanterns full. This has been Liam Blackwood, and you've been listening to Occam's Lantern.